It begins not with silence, but with a scream. A single cry cuts through the noise of a rising city. At the heart of a construction site where steel beams stretch like the bones of a giant, a man slips. His helmet falls first, spinning through the dusty air, and then his body follows, 40 feet down, 40 feet too far. By the time he hits the concrete below, the site has already changed. What was once the rhythm of hammers and drills is now the rhythm of chaos. Men drop their tools, someone shouts for help, another runs for the phone. Sirens in the distance grow louder, like predators closing in. The fallen worker lies motionless, blood pooling across the gray concrete. His friends kneel beside him, desperate, shaking his body, calling his name. Someone presses cloth against the wound. Someone else weeps. Dust hangs in the air like smoke after a battlefield. And in those few minutes, the site transforms from a place of ambition into a place of fear. The ambulance arrives. Tires screech. Medics rush forward, carrying their bags, their faces sharp with urgency. The crew cuts through the crowd of workers, kneeling, checking for pulse, checking for breath. They strap the man to a stretcher, oxygen mask pressed against his pale face, while others push the crowd back. Questions begin to spill. What happened? Did anyone see him fall? Was he wearing his harness? But answers are drowned in noise. The cries of workers, the clash of metal, the rising wail of sirens. As the stretcher is loaded into the ambulance, the silence deepens. The workers know the truth. He might not survive. And if he doesn't, this will not just be a tragedy. It will become something much larger. A ripple that reaches beyond the site, beyond the city, into the offices of investigators, inspectors, and officials who hold the power to decide what comes next. They are the kings of accidents, the unseen. Guardians who rise only when disaster strikes. They do not wear crowns, but their words are law. They do not carry weapons, but they carry authority. And soon they will arrive. Because every accident leaves behind not just blood and broken bones, but questions, and someone must answer them. By the next morning, the construction site was no longer a place of progress. It was a crime scene. Yellow tape fluttered in the wind, stretching across steel beams and machinery. Reporters gathered outside the gate, their cameras pointed at the silence within. Workers stood in clusters, whispering, their faces pale with fear. Some avoided eye contact, others smoked nervously, waiting for the men everyone knew would come. Then they arrived. Black cars, official crests, polished shoes stepping onto the dusty ground. The investigators, the kings of accidents. They didn't need to raise their voices. Their presence alone commanded silence. Clipboards in hand, eyes scanning the chaos, they moved with precision. They had seen this before, too many times. A man dead or dying, a site frozen in shame, and a trail of questions that could burn reputations to ash. The lead inspector bent down where the worker had fallen. He touched the cracked concrete, then looked up at the scaffolding towering above. His voice was low, but it carried authority. Who was responsible for safety checks here? The site manager, sweating under the morning sun, stammered, searching for words. Every pause felt like guilt. The workers watched, terrified, knowing that every answer could decide not only who was to blame, but who would lose everything. The investigators split into pairs. One examined the broken harness tossed aside like useless rope. Another demanded access to daily safety logs. A third began questioning the men who had been closest to the victim. Did you see him fall? Did he have his belt on? Was he told to rush the job? Each answer was scribbled down, every hesitation noted. Truth here was not just about facts, it was about survival. Managers feared fines, supervisors feared dismissal, workers feared revenge if they spoke against their bosses. Inside a small office on the site, a TA, Blee became an interrogation room. The foreman sat across from two inspectors, his hands trembling as he lit a cigarette he wasn't allowed to smoke. The questions rained down. How often were the safety drills conducted? Were helmets inspected? Did you sign these documents yourself? He looked at the paper in front of him, his own signature staring back like a curse. He whispered, We were behind schedule. We skipped a few checks. The pen in the inspector's hand paused, then resumed, scratching out his confession in black ink. Outside, workers whispered about the man who had fallen. Some called him unlucky. Others said the company killed him with its hunger for speed. But above all, they knew something had changed. The investigators were here, and once they began, nothing would remain hidden. Every bolt, every harness, every paper trail was now evidence, and soon these kings of accidents would decide the fate of the site, the managers, and even the future of how work would be done. For now, the city kept building. The skyline rose higher, But in the shadows of progress, men in black coats and sharp eyes were piecing together the story of how one man's fall could bring an empire of steel and concrete to its knees. The investigation spread like fire through paper. Files were pulled from dusty cabinets, logbooks dragged from drawers that had not been opened in months. Every scrap of paper, every line of ink, every signature became a piece of evidence. The kings of accidents were relentless. They moved like hunters, chasing not prey, but truth. The scaffolding was examined first. Engineers measured the angles, tested the bolts, pulled at the joints. One inspector climbed halfway up, gripping the cold steel with practiced hands. His voice echoed down. "This frame is loose. Look at this connector. It hasn't been replaced in years." Below, the site manager swallowed hard, his eyes fixed on the ground. Then came the harness. Torn, frayed at the edges, it lay on the inspector's table like the final clue in a murder case. He ran his fingers along the fabric, his face darkening. "This should have been condemned months ago," he said flatly. "It's not equipment, it's a death sentence." His words cut through the room, leaving silence in their wake. The workers began to speak, their voices hesitant at first, then braver with each question. One man admitted the foreman had pushed them to finish faster. Another revealed that safety checks had been skipped for weeks. A third whispered that the fallen worker had complained about the faulty harness just 2 days earlier. Each voice was another nail in the coffin of the company's defense. Inside the site office, the walls seemed to close in on the supervisors. The investigators laid out photographs, reports, testimonies. A timeline began to form, sharp and merciless. The victim's last morning was reconstructed step by step. His climb onto the scaffolding, the strap he fastened, the moment it snapped. Every second was written down, as if fate itself had been captured on paper. But the kings of accidents knew that the truth was not just in in steel and fabric. It was in the choices made long before that day. Budgets cut, corners ignored, deadlines forced, human lives weighed against profit margins and lost. One inspector, older than the rest, leaned back in his chair, his voice gravelly with years of cases just like this one. "Accidents don't just happen," he said. "They are built from greed, built from neglect. And this one was built piece by piece until the man had no chance." By evening, the evidence was overwhelming. The investigators closed their folders, their expressions grave but certain. The workers went home whispering, the managers sat in silence, and the city outside carried on as if nothing had happened. But inside those black cars waiting at the gate, the kings of accidents carried with them the power to decide the site's fate. And soon their verdict would be written, not in the language of sorrow, but in the language of authority, the accident permit. A single document that would seal the company's shame and force new rules that could save lives yet to be born. The accident was no longer just a tragedy. It had become a battlefield. In the boardrooms, in the site offices, and even in the dark corners of the workers' dormitories, the war of blame had begun. The company's executives gathered around a long table polished to a shine, their faces tight with fear and calculation. They spoke in whispers at first, then louder, arguing over strategy. "We cannot admit fault," one said sharply. "If we do, the fines will bury us." Another leaned forward, tapping the table with his pen. "Then who do we blame? The worker? The foreman? A single man's mistake is easier to accept than corporate negligence." The silence that followed was colder than stone. Meanwhile, at the construction site, the workers murmured among themselves. Some feared speaking the truth, others burned with anger. "They'll try to make him look careless," one man spat, his fists clenched. "But he told us the harness was broken." Fear rippled through the crowd, fear that if they spoke, they would lose their jobs, their pay, their future. Yet fear of silence weighed even heavier. The inspectors watched all of this unfold like kings observing a court of liars and desperate men. They had seen this dance before. The shuffle of guilt, the twisting of words, the pointing of fingers in every direction, but upward. They knew the truth lay somewhere between the trembling confessions and the polished statements prepared by lawyers. One meeting grew heated. The site manager, red-faced and sweating, slammed his fist on the table. "It wasn't me. I followed orders. You want the truth? The deadlines were impossible. The company told me to push harder, faster, no matter what." His voice cracked, and suddenly the room was silent. The inspectors wrote every word, their pens slicing through the paper like knives. Lawyers entered the stage next, carrying briefcases full of straws. Adages. They tried to twist the story. The worker was careless. He ignored safety training. He chose not to secure himself properly. But the evidence was a wall too high to climb. The broken harness, the missing inspection logs, the testimonies of the workers, all of it stood firm, like a jury that refused to be swayed. Yet politics is never clean. Behind the scenes, phone calls were made, officials were pressured, promises whispered. If this permit is too harsh, projects will stall, money will vanish, jobs will disappear. The kings of accidents heard it all, but their faces betrayed nothing. They had only one duty: the truth. Outside, the city buzzed with rumors. Newspapers splashed headlines across their front pages. Construction giant under fire. Television anchors debated who was to blame, voices rising in outrage. For the families of workers, it was not politics, it was grief. They held candles in the night, photos of the fallen man clutched in trembling hands. Children wept, wives prayed, and fathers cursed the steel towers that had taken so much. The kings of accidents gathered their notes, their files, their witness statements. The politics of blame raged louder each day, but inside those folders was the quiet, unshakable truth. And soon, no amount of money, no lawyer's clever tongue, no whisper in the dark would be able to erase what had already been written. The storm was building, and at its heart waited a single sheet of paper, the permit that would decide who was guilty, who would pay, and how the future would be reshaped. The silence of the site was broken not by hammers or drills, but by the scratching of pens across paper. The accident was no longer just a story whispered among workers. It had become a file thick with evidence, marked with stamps, and bound in the grip of bureaucracy. The kings of accidents had begun the process. In a small office lit by a single buzzing fluorescent light, documents were spread across a wooden desk. Photographs of the broken harness, diagrams of the scaffolding, witness testimonies written in shaky handwriting, medical reports stamped with hospital seals. It was all here, the anatomy of failure, preserved forever in ink. The inspectors worked methodically. One dictated, another typed, another cross-checked every figure and line. Their language was not dramatic. It was precise, sharp, and merciless. They did not write about grief or tears. They wrote about measurements, compliance codes, and violations. Where the families saw tragedy, the kings of accidents saw evidence. And in their world, evidence was everything. Forms were filled, incident report, fatal, boxes ticked, equipment failure confirmed, notes scribbled, negligence detected at supervisory level. Each page became a brick in the wall of responsibility. The wall was growing higher with every passing hour, impossible for the guilty to climb. The company sent in its representatives, trying to soften the blow. Polished shoes clicked on the floor. Suits leaned across the table, voices dripping with practiced calm. Surely this was an isolated incident. Surely this was human error, not systemic failure. But the inspectors did not look up. Their pens moved, their voices monotone, their questions sharp. Show us the inspection logs. Show us the training records. Show us the proof that this site met safety standards. The silence that followed was louder than any siren. The workers were called in to sign statements. Some hesitated, afraid of retaliation. Others signed with shaking hands, their words etched onto official paper like confessions to a crime they had not committed. For them, the process was alien, distant. But they knew one thing. Their friend had died, and this document, this accident permit, was the only chance his death would mean something more than another forgotten tragedy. Days turned into nights. The file grew heavier. Stamps thudded onto paper, signatures lined up in neat rows. Step by step, the process moved forward, unstoppable. And then, the moment came. The draft of the accident permit itself. It was not dramatic to look at. A plain sheet, typed in black ink, filled with legal terms and clauses. But its power was immense. It carried the weight of authority, the seal of the state, the judgment of the kings of accidents. It named the site. It named the company. It named the failures that had killed a man, and it demanded change. The draft would be reviewed, revised, signed, and sealed. Only then would it be delivered back to the company as both punishment and command. It was not a suggestion, it was law. For the executives, it was a death sentence for their reputation. For the workers, it was a fragile shield against future neglect. For the family of the fallen man, it was a bitter reminder that justice often came in the form of paper, not compassion. And yet, Within that single document lay the chance to prevent the next fall, the next scream, the next pool of blood on cold concrete. That was the purpose. That was the power. And the kings of accidents knew it well. The days of investigation turned into weeks. Files grew taller, witness statements piled higher, and the walls of the temporary office seemed to close in under the weight of paperwork. Yet, within this chaos, order was forming. Piece by piece, the investigators had built their case. Now, the final report was ready to be written. The kings of accidents gathered in silence. Their faces were stern, their pens poised like weapons. On the long table before them lay the evidence: the torn harness, photographs of the scaffolding, inspection logs with missing pages, medical reports marked in red. Each item was a voice of the dead man, each one whispering the truth louder than the company's excuses. The lead inspector began to speak, his words measured and heavy. "We have established cause: equipment failure, neglect of safety standards, and systemic disregard for regulations. Responsibility lies with the management. Supervisory staff failed to act. Inspections were skipped. Warnings were ignored." His voice echoed through the room, not loud, but absolute. The others nodded, making final notes, stamping papers, aligning signatures. The report was not just a document, it was a verdict. In its lines, blame was assigned, guilt was recorded, and punishment was prepared. When the last signature was written, silence fell. For a moment, it was as if the city itself held its breath. Then came the permit. The accident permit. It looked plain, almost ordinary, a sheet of paper no different from thousands of others stamped by the state. But for those who understood, it was monumental. It was the judgment of the kings of accidents, transformed into law. The permit declared the site unsafe until new safety measures were in place. It ordered the replacement of all equipment. It demanded mandatory safety training for every worker. It imposed heavy fines on the company, cutting into the profits that had been valued above human life. And most importantly, it carried the warning that failure to comply would mean permanent closure. When the executives received it, their faces drained of color. The polished arrogance that once filled their meetings vanished. They read the clauses line by line, each word striking like a hammer. There was no appeal, no negotiation, no way to escape. The kings of accidents had spoken, and their word was final. For the workers, the permit was both justice and survival. It meant helmets would be inspected, harnesses replaced, and safety drills enforced. It meant no man would be forced to climb scaffolding without protection again. It meant the death of their friend had changed something written in black ink that could not be erased. The family of the fallen worker received a copy as well. To them, it was bitter. Paper could not replace a father, a husband, a brother. Yet they held it tightly, knowing his death had not been forgotten. His name was etched in the lines between the words. A ghost carried in official language, reminding everyone of the cost of neglect. And so the permit was sealed, filed, and delivered. A plain document, yes, but one with the weight of a crown. Because in the end, the kings of accidents did not rule with swords or thrones. They ruled with paper, with ink, with authority. They ruled with the power to change the future by rewriting the rules of the present. The city outside carried on. Towers continued to rise. Machines continued to roar. But on that site, under the shadow of the scaffolding where one man had fallen, nothing was the same. The accident permit stood as a silent guardian, a promise carved into law that his death would not be in vain.